He doesn't even deserve to sit here, Olivia Carter said, and the entire table laughed like it was the most natural truth in the world. I remember the exact moment the glass in my hand stopped feeling like glass and started feeling like something I only held to look normal. My name is Ethan Carter, 38 years old, standing in a rented banquet hall in downtown Chicago where the air smelled like expensive wine I wasn't really part of. I didn't react. That was the first rule I had learned somewhere between losing respect and losing the need to fight for it in rooms like this. Olivia stood across from me in a deep navy dress, perfectly composed, the kind of presence that made people lean in when she spoke and forget I was even there when she stopped. Her friends surrounded her like an audience already convinced she was the main character in every story. One of them raised a glass and added, "Honestly, Olivia, you could have done so much better." And she smiled without hesitation, not even a flicker of discomfort, like I was a topic already settled. I had heard worse before, not always in words but in silence, in decisions, in the way conversations ended when I entered them. Still, something about tonight felt different, like the room had collectively agreed I was no longer worth pretending around. I set my glass down carefully, not because I was angry, but because I knew if I didn't control my movements I would start showing something they expected from me, something weak, something reactive. Olivia glanced at me then, just briefly, as if checking whether I understood my role in the scene she was performing. She had always been good at performance. In meetings, in dinners, in introductions where she shaped herself into exactly what people wanted to see. But at home, she no longer shaped anything around me. At home, I had become background noise. "Ethan," she said finally, her voice calm, but edged with that practiced disappointment she used when correcting something beneath her standards. "You really should stop pretending you belong in conversations like this." A few people chuckled again, softer this time, like they were easing into something familiar. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because I had learned that disagreement in rooms like this only fed the narrative they already built about you. Instead, I looked around the table, at the polished faces, the easy confidence, the assumption that I had nothing in me worth questioning their judgment. What none of them knew was that I had spent the last 7 years building something they never saw, something I never spoke about, something I intentionally buried beneath the version of me they found convenient to underestimate. Olivia leaned slightly toward her friend and whispered something that made them laugh again, and I caught fragments of it. Words like safe, predictable, and no ambition. Words she used like facts instead of opinions. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone could speak so confidently about a life they stopped trying to understand. The room was warm, almost uncomfortably so, but I felt something colder settle in my chest. Not anger exactly, more like clarity, like a door quietly closing inside me that I didn't realize had been open for too long. I reached for my phone out of habit, then stopped myself. Not yet. That thought came without emotion, without drama, just a simple acknowledgement of timing. Olivia turned back to the table, already moving on from me and her attention, already back in her element, and I realized then that for her, this moment wasn't even significant. It was routine. I was routine. And somewhere in that realization, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. I took a slow breath, adjusted my posture slightly, and let the silence around me continue without interruption, because sometimes the most important decisions begin in moments where you choose not to be seen. The silence that followed did not last long. It never does in rooms like that, because silence makes people uncomfortable when they are used to filling every gap with judgment. Olivia Carter was already back in motion, laughing softly at something her friend said, as if what she had just done required no reflection at all. I stayed seated, my hands resting near the edge of the table, steady, controlled, almost invisible. Around us, the conversation shifted into easier topics: weekend plans, new restaurants in downtown Chicago, someone complaining about a delayed flight from Denver, normal things that people use to avoid noticing what just happened in front of them. I understood that rhythm well. It was the rhythm of ignoring discomfort until it disappears or until someone else absorbs it. Olivia leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed, her confidence untouched, and for a moment she looked almost relieved, like she had reaffirmed a belief she had been carrying for a long time. I was not angry at her in that moment. Anger would have required participation, and I had already started stepping away from that expectation. Instead, I watched her the way someone observes a familiar pattern they no longer intend to follow. The waiter came by and refilled glasses, asking if we needed anything else, and Olivia answered for both of us without even looking in my direction, saying everything was fine, as if my presence did not require individual acknowledgement. That small detail should have bothered me more than it did, but instead it confirmed something I had already begun to accept. I had been living in a version of the world where my input was optional. After the dinner plates were cleared, the group began shifting towards stories about careers, promotions, and future plans. Olivia spoke with confidence about the position she was pursuing at Hayes Global Group, describing it as the next natural step in her career, the kind of opportunity she felt she had earned through years of effort. People around the table nodded, impressed, validating her ambition in the way she expected. I listened quietly, not interrupting, not correcting, not reacting. Hayes Global Group. The name landed differently in my mind than it did for everyone else at the table. To them, it was just a respected firm, a strong career opportunity, a place where someone like Olivia could finally be recognized at the level she believed she deserved. To me, it was something already in motion, something structured, something aligned with decisions made long before she ever applied. Olivia continued speaking, describing her vision for leadership, her ideas about restructuring departments, her belief that she could bring a more modern direction to the company. She was confident, articulate, completely unaware of how small those ambitions sounded in the context of what she did not know. I remember watching her hands move as she spoke, expressive, precise, the same hands that had once written notes about shared plans that no longer existed between us. At some point, one of her friends asked me directly what I thought about her opportunity, and the table briefly turned its attention toward me again. It was not curiosity, it was more like obligation, a social expectation to include the quiet object at the table before moving on. I took a moment before answering, choosing my words carefully, not because I was uncertain, but because I understood that anything I said would be interpreted through the lens they had already assigned to me. It sounds important to her, I said simply. A few polite smiles followed, the kind people give when they want to acknowledge participation without inviting depth. Olivia did not look at me this time. She was already focused on her phone, scrolling briefly, likely reviewing something related to her upcoming application process. The rest of the conversation drifted again, and I allowed myself to step further back mentally, observing without engaging. There was a time when I would have tried to correct misunderstandings, to explain context, to assert myself in rooms like this. That version of me felt distant now, almost unnecessary. When the evening began to wind down, people started gathering their things, chairs scraping lightly against the polished floor, conversations breaking into smaller goodbyes. Olivia stood first, smoothing her dress, already transitioning into the next part of her night, already mentally leaving before physically doing so. She glanced at me briefly and said she would see me at home later, her tone neutral, transactional, like a schedule reminder rather than a personal exchange. I nodded again, not because it meant agreement, but because I no longer saw value in extending moments that had already reached their conclusion. As she walked away with her friends toward the elevator, I remained seated for a few seconds longer, watching the reflection of the chandelier lights fade in the glass surface of the empty table. The room slowly emptied around me, leaving behind the faint sound of staff beginning to reset the space. I reached into my pocket, finally taking out my phone, and this time I did not hesitate. There were messages waiting, not from the people at that table, but from a different layer of my life, a layer that had remained quiet for a long time, but was no longer inactive. I looked at the screen without expression, reading the confirmation I had been expecting. Everything was already in place, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself a single thought that did not belong to the person they believed I was. The drive home was quiet in a way that did not feel empty, but instead felt structured, like something had been placed into order without anyone announcing it. Chicago traffic moved in its usual rhythm outside the window, headlights stretching across wet pavement from a light rain that had started falling somewhere between downtown and the expressway. I kept both hands on the steering wheel, not because I needed to focus harder than usual, but because I wanted to stay present in a moment that no longer required emotional interpretation. Olivia had left the venue 10 minutes earlier with her friends, already speaking about dinner plans for the next day and a follow-up meeting she had scheduled with the Human Resources Department at Hayes Global Group. She had not asked me anything before leaving, not about my evening, not about the ride home, not even about whether I would be late. That absence of inquiry used to feel like distance, but tonight it felt more like confirmation of a pattern I had already mapped. When I reached the intersection near our apartment building, I slowed the car and allowed myself a brief pause. The streetlights reflected off the windshield in soft streaks, and I could see people walking along the sidewalk with umbrellas, moving through their own routines without interruption. I remember thinking how simple it was for most people to assume their world would continue exactly as expected. I parked in the underground garage, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the elevator without rushing. The building was quiet, the kind of residential silence that exists in expensive parts of a city where sound is controlled by design rather than circumstance. When I entered the apartment, the lights were already on upstairs. Olivia had returned before me. I could hear faint movement, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the subtle rhythm of someone preparing for the next day. I placed my keys on the counter and stood there for a moment without moving further into the space. This apartment had once felt shared in every sense of the word, but lately it had started to feel like parallel occupancy rather than shared life. Olivia appeared at the top of the stairs a few seconds later, holding a tablet in one hand and a cup of water in the other. She looked down at me briefly, her expression neutral, then continued walking toward the bedroom without stopping. "You are late," she said casually, not as a question, but as an observation that required no response. I glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was just after 9:30 in the evening. By any standard, I was not late. But I understood what she meant was not about time. It was about expectation. I followed her upstairs without speaking. In the bedroom, she placed her tablet on the dresser and began reviewing documents again, scrolling through pages related to her application at Hayes Global Group. Her focus was complete, the same kind of focus she used to reserve for high-priority work meetings when she was preparing for presentations. I stood near the doorway for a moment, watching her without interrupting. There was no hostility in the room, no argument waiting to happen, only distance that had become normalized through repetition. After a few seconds, I asked a simple question, not to challenge her, but to confirm something I already understood. "Are you certain this is the direction you want?" She did not look up immediately. When she finally did, her expression carried mild impatience, not anger, but the kind of dismissal, reserved for conversations she considered already resolved. "Of course I am certain," she said. "This is exactly where I am supposed to be." I nodded once, accepting the answer without further inquiry. She returned to her screen, and the conversation ended before it truly began. I left the room and walked into the hallway, where the light was dimmer and quieter. The apartment layout was familiar enough that I could move through it without thinking, but tonight I found myself noticing details I had previously ignored. The way the lighting was adjusted for aesthetic comfort rather than function. The way every surface reflected careful selection, curated over time to present a specific image of success and stability. None of it felt unfamiliar, but something about it felt incomplete. I stopped near the kitchen counter again and opened my phone. There were no new messages from Olivia, only a notification from an encrypted channel I had not used in months. The message contained a single line of confirmation. "Internal review scheduled for Hayes Global Group acquisition finalization, 48 hours. I read it twice without changing my expression. This was not a surprise. It was the final alignment of decisions that had already been made long before this night. I placed the phone down on the counter and looked toward the living room, where everything appeared normal, unchanged, almost deliberately ordinary. For most people, this would have been the end of the evening. Dinner conversations would have been forgotten, small disagreements would have been dismissed, and tomorrow would have been expected to continue, as usual. But I understood something different now. Some changes do not announce themselves with noise or confrontation. Some changes only become visible when the structure they support is already shifting beneath the surface, quietly, irreversibly, and without permission. The morning arrived without ceremony, as it usually does in cities that never fully sleep and never fully wake. Light filtered through the blinds of the bedroom in thin, angled lines, cutting across the floor like something measured rather than natural. I was already awake before the alarm sounded. Olivia was still asleep beside me, turned slightly away, one arm resting loosely near the edge of the blanket. For a moment, I simply observed the stillness of the room, not as something peaceful, but as something temporary, like a paused frame that would eventually resume motion without warning. When the alarm finally rang, she reached over and turned it off without opening her eyes. "I have a meeting at 8, she said quietly, her voice still carrying sleep. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I sat up and looked toward the window, where the city was already active in small, predictable ways, cars moving, distant sirens fading into the background, the structure of daily life continuing without interruption. "Is that at Hayes Global Group?" I asked after a moment. She nodded without hesitation. "Final review session," she said. "If everything goes well, I will be moving into the leadership track immediately." There was a sense of certainty in her tone, the kind that comes from believing the next step in your life is already guaranteed. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen while she prepared to get ready. The apartment felt different in the morning light, not changed, but exposed, as if the previous night had removed a layer of illusion that used to soften everything. Olivia came down a few minutes later, dressed in a tailored outfit that reflected precision and ambition, her hair perfectly arranged, her attention already divided between her appearance and her upcoming day. She poured herself coffee and glanced at her phone repeatedly while standing at the counter. "Today matters," she said, more to herself than to me. I leaned against the counter opposite her, observing her in silence for a moment. "Why Hayes Global Group specifically?" I asked. She looked up briefly, surprised by the question, as if the answer had already been established long ago and did not require revisiting. "Because it is where real leadership decisions are made," she said. "It is where I can actually build something meaningful." I nodded slowly, not challenging her, not correcting her, simply acknowledging her perspective. She finished her coffee quickly and placed the cup in the sink without washing it, something she normally would have corrected in me if I had done the same. That detail passed without comment. Before leaving, she paused at the door, adjusting her coat and checking her reflection in the mirror near the entryway. "You will be home tonight?" she asked. It was not a question of desire or connection, but of logistics. "Yes," I said. She nodded once and left. The door closed softly behind her, and the apartment returned to silence. I remained standing in the kitchen for several minutes without moving. Then I opened my laptop and placed it on the counter. The screen illuminated the space with a cold, controlled glow. There were no visible signs of urgency, no flashing alerts, no dramatic indicators. Everything had already been set in motion long before this morning. I accessed a secure folder and reviewed the final documentation once again. The acquisition structure for Hayes Global Group was complete, layered through multiple holding entities and finalized through approvals that had been signed weeks earlier. Olivia's name appeared nowhere in any ownership chain or decision authority. Her role, as far as the organization was concerned, existed entirely within perception, not control. I closed the document and leaned back slightly, letting the information settle without emotional interference. There was no satisfaction in it, and no disappointment either. It was simply alignment between reality and structure. A few minutes later, my phone vibrated. A message from an internal advisor confirmed that the final board session had begun. I read it once and placed the phone back down. The timing was no longer theoretical. It was active. I looked around the apartment again, noticing how still everything remained despite what was already unfolding beneath it. The idea that most people lived entirely within visible consequences suddenly felt distant. In this case, nothing visible had changed yet, but everything had already been decided. I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dim reflection of the morning. The city outside continued its normal rhythm, unaware of the transitions already locked into place behind closed doors. I picked up my jacket and prepared to leave, not because I needed to be present for what was coming, but because some outcomes do not require participation to be irreversible. The city felt different that afternoon, not because anything visible had changed, but because I was no longer experiencing it through the same internal filter I had used for years. Driving toward downtown Chicago, I kept a steady pace along Lakeshore Drive, watching the reflection of sunlight scatter across Lake Michigan in slow, fragmented patterns. Traffic moved with its usual indifference. cars changing lanes with no awareness of anything beyond their immediate destination. I arrived at the office building just after 10 in the morning. Hayes Global Group occupied the upper floors, the kind of space designed to signal control rather than comfort, glass walls, controlled lighting, and reception areas that felt intentionally neutral. I entered through the main lobby and checked in under my legal name, something I had not needed to use in this context for a long time. The receptionist smiled politely, unaware of anything beyond standard protocol, and directed me to the executive elevator. When I reached the top floor, I could already sense the shift in atmosphere. The energy here was not casual or conversational. It was structured, restrained, and carefully managed, the kind of environment where every interaction carried consequence even when no one spoke about it directly. I stepped into the conference level and was guided toward a glass meeting room where the final review session was already in progress. Through the transparent wall, I could see Olivia seated at the long table, positioned near the center, engaged in discussion with several executives. She was speaking with confidence, presenting points she had clearly prepared in advance, her posture aligned with the expectations of authority she believed she was stepping into. I stopped just outside the door and observed for a moment without entering. There was no urgency in the room, no visible tension, only the quiet structure of decision-making unfolding in real time. One of the senior executives nodded as she finished speaking, then turned toward the head of the table, where final approvals were being considered. I could see Olivia's expression shift slightly as she waited, her focus entirely on the outcome of this moment. The door behind me opened softly. A legal advisor approached and stood beside me without speaking immediately. Then, after a brief pause, he said the final confirmations had been executed. The acquisition structure was now fully active. I nodded once and stepped forward into the room. My entrance did not create disruption, only attention. Conversations paused gradually, not because I demanded it, but because something in the structure of the room required recalibration. Olivia looked up first, her expression neutral at first, then slightly uncertain as she registered my presence in this context. I walked to the far side of the table and placed a single document folder down in front of me without opening it. The room remained quiet. One of the executives asked if there was an issue with the process, and I responded calmly that everything had proceeded exactly as planned. Then I turned my attention toward Olivia. She was still seated, watching carefully now, her earlier confidence replaced by measured curiosity. I did not raise my voice. I did not alter my tone. I simply stated that the final structure of Hayes Global Group had been completed under consolidated ownership, effective immediately. There was a brief pause as the words settled in the room. I continued by clarifying that all leadership applications, including hers, were now subject to internal review under the new governance framework. Olivia's expression changed subtly, not dramatically, but enough to indicate that she was processing information that did not align with her expectations. She asked a question, carefully phrased, about what exactly I meant by consolidated ownership. I looked at her directly for the first time since entering the room and said that the company she intended to lead was already under my control through finalized acquisition channels that had been executed weeks earlier. There was no reaction from the room at first, only silence as individuals processed the implications. Independently, Olivia remained still, her focus fixed on me now, searching for clarification that did not immediately arrive. I explained further, in simple terms, that her application had been reviewed under assumptions that no longer applied, and that all leadership decisions would now be reevaluated under the updated structure. The tone in the room shifted, not into chaos, but into recalibration, as executives began to quietly confirm details among themselves. Olivia finally spoke again, her voice controlled but no longer entirely steady, asking when this decision had been made. I answered without hesitation that it had been in progress long before her application began. That statement did not carry emotion. It carried timeline. She looked down at the table for a moment, then back up, as if attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events from a perspective that now no longer fit. I did not move closer, and I did not press further. Instead, I simply confirmed that her professional path within the organization would now be reviewed under standard evaluation procedures, without preferential assumptions or anticipated outcomes. The legal advisor beside me stepped forward and provided formal confirmation of the structural transition, handing copies of documentation to the table. Olivia did not touch hers immediately. She only looked at it. I remained where I was, allowing the information to exist without interpretation. The room continued to function, but the hierarchy within it had already shifted in ways that were not visible through movement or expression. I closed the folder I had placed earlier and prepared to leave. As I turned toward the exit, the last thing I heard was not a question or a reaction, but the sound of silence settling into a new configuration, one that no longer included the assumptions that had existed that morning. The drive back from the headquarters felt quieter than the drive there, but it was not the same kind of quiet I had experienced before. This silence was no longer about waiting or anticipation. It was about completion. The city moved past the car windows in steady motion, people crossing streets, delivery trucks stopping and starting at predictable intervals, life continuing exactly as it always had. Yet for me, something had already crossed a threshold that could not be reversed by normal daily activity. I kept my hands steady on the steering wheel, following the route back toward the residential district where Olivia and I lived, though the word lived no longer carried the same meaning in my mind. When I arrived at the building, I parked in the same underground garage, took the elevator up, and walked into the apartment without hesitation. The lights inside were on, but the space felt empty in a different way than physical absence. It felt unanchored, like something essential had been removed without any visible disturbance. Olivia was not in the main living area. I could hear movement from the bedroom, soft and deliberate, like someone organizing thoughts through physical action. I did not announce my presence. Instead, I placed my jacket on the chair near the entrance and walked slowly toward the hallway. The bedroom door was slightly open. Inside, Olivia stood near the dresser, not moving quickly, but also not resting. She was fully dressed, not in the calm routine of evening or morning, but in a state that suggested she had not fully decided what came next. Her attention was divided between her phone and the room around her, as if trying to re-establish context for something that no longer matched her expectations. She noticed me in the reflection of the mirror before she turned around. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was different here than it had been in the office. In that space, silence was procedural. Here, it was personal, heavier, more direct. "You did not tell me," she said finally, her voice controlled but carrying an edge that had not been there before. I remained at the doorway, not entering further than necessary. "There was nothing to tell in advance," I replied calmly. She turned fully toward me now, placing her phone down on the dresser. "Nothing to tell," she repeated, as if testing the structure of that sentence. "You bought the company I was applying to lead, and you call that nothing." I did not respond immediately. Instead, I considered her. Words without reaction. Then I stepped slightly into the room, not to close distance, but to establish clarity. "The company was never waiting for your application to determine its direction," I said. "The structure was already in place before that process began." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression shifting between disbelief and calculation, as if trying to identify a point in time where her understanding had diverged from reality. "So what happens now?" she asked, more quietly this time, to me. The question was direct, stripped of earlier confidence, no longer framed as ambition but as uncertainty. I answered in the same controlled tone I had used throughout the day. "Nothing immediate changes for you personally," I said. "But your assumption about position and control within that organization no longer applies." She sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, not dramatically, but with a sense of delayed processing, like her body had reached a conclusion before her thoughts had fully caught up. I remained standing. The room felt still, but not frozen. It was the stillness that comes after a structure has already settled into its new form. Olivia looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at me. "Was any of it real?" she asked, not referring to the company, but to something larger. I did not misinterpret the question, but I also did not answer it in emotional terms. Instead, I responded with precision. "Everything you experienced was consistent with the information you had at the time," I said. That was the only answer I could give without creating a narrative that did not belong to either of us. She nodded slightly, though it was not clear whether she agreed or simply acknowledged the limitation of further explanation. After a few seconds, I turned slightly toward the door. There was no need to remain in the room longer than necessary. As I stepped back into the hallway, I could hear her remain seated, not moving, not speaking. The apartment around us remained unchanged in structure, but something within its function had already shifted. The systems that had previously operated under shared assumptions no longer aligned in the same way. I walked toward the living room and paused near the window. Outside, the city continued its normal cycle of movement and noise, unaware of the recalibration that had already taken place within this space. I placed my hand lightly on the window frame and looked out without focus, not searching for anything, but confirming that nothing external needed to change for internal structure to be complete. Behind me, the apartment remained quiet, not unresolved, not chaotic, simply adjusted. And in that adjustment, there was no requirement for further explanation. The following morning did not begin with conversation. It began with absence. I woke up before the alarm again, but this time the stillness in the apartment felt final rather than temporary. The space beside me in bed was empty, not recently vacated, but deliberately unused, as if the idea of shared routine had already been removed from consideration. I got up slowly, walked into the hallway, and noticed Olivia's bedroom door was open. Inside, the closet was partially open, and a suitcase sat on the bed, not fully packed, but clearly in progress. There was no urgency in the arrangement. It looked like a decision made in controlled stages rather than emotional reaction. I did not call out to her. Instead, I moved to the kitchen and prepared a cup of coffee, observing the apartment as if it were a system temporarily out of sync rather than a place in collapse. A few minutes later, Olivia appeared in the doorway. She was holding her phone, but she was not looking at it. Her expression was composed, but the energy around her was different, no longer aligned with the rhythm she had maintained for years. "I have a flight this afternoon," she said. Her voice was steady, but it carried a separation that did not require explanation. I nodded once, acknowledging the information without commentary. She walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and closed it again without taking anything. Then she leaned slightly against the counter, not looking at me directly. "I spoke with the board liaison this morning," she said. "They confirmed everything is already implemented." I did not respond immediately. The confirmation was not necessary for me, but I allowed her to continue. "They said my application is no longer relevant under the current structure," she added, almost as if repeating something she was still trying to accept herself. I placed my coffee down on the counter. "That is correct," I said calmly. There was no emotional weight in the answer, only alignment with established fact. She exhaled slowly, then looked toward the window, avoiding direct eye contact. Outside, the city was already fully active, sunlight reflecting off glass buildings, traffic moving in predictable streams below. "So what was I working toward?" she asked, not as accusation, but as recalibration. I took a moment before answering, choosing clarity over interpretation. "You were working toward a role that no longer existed in the form you expected," I said. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she turned slightly away, as if reorganizing her internal structure in real time. The silence between us was no longer about distance. It was about definition. After a few seconds, she spoke again. "You never told me anything," she said. I looked at her directly for the first time that morning. "You never asked the kind of questions that would have changed the answer," I replied. That statement was not intended as criticism. It was observation. She absorbed it without interruption. Then she nodded once, slowly, as if accepting that certain narratives could not be rewritten at the point of discovery. She picked up her phone again, checked something briefly, then placed it back down on the counter. "I will be gone for a few days," she said. "I need to understand what I am going to do next." "That is reasonable," I answered. There was no resistance in my response, only acknowledgement of process. She looked at me one last time, not with anger, not with pleading, but with a kind of quiet reassessment, as if trying to locate the version of me she had previously categorized. Then she turned and walked back toward the bedroom to continue packing. I remained in the kitchen, finishing my coffee without rushing. The apartment felt different again, but not unstable. It had transitioned into a state of reduced interaction, where movement and intention no longer intersected in the same way. A short time later, I heard the suitcase wheels roll across the floor. Olivia appeared at the entrance with a coat over her arm and her phone in hand. She paused briefly before leaving. I do not know what this makes us, she said quietly. I considered the question without attaching emotion to it. It makes clarity, I replied. She nodded slightly, then opened the door. Before stepping out, she stopped once more, but did not turn back. I thought I understood how things worked, she said. I did not respond. She left, and the door closed behind her with a sound that did not echo. I remained where I was for several moments, listening to the absence settle into the space she had occupied. The apartment was quieter now, but it was not empty in the way people assume. It was simply no longer layered with competing expectations. I finished my coffee, placed the cup in the sink, and looked out the window. The city continued its movement without interruption. Nothing about it suggested that anything significant had changed. And yet, within the structure of what had been built and what had now been removed, everything had already reached its conclusion. The apartment remained unchanged in structure after Olivia left, but the absence she created was no longer something that needed interpretation. It was simply part of the environment now, like a system component that had been removed without causing failure in the remaining structure. I woke up early again, not because of habit, but because sleep itself had become unnecessary in the way it used to function. The morning light entered the apartment at an angle that made everything look more defined, edges sharper, surfaces clearer, as if the space itself had adjusted to reduced complexity. I prepared coffee and stood by the window, observing the movement of the city below. Cars merged into lanes, pedestrians crossed intersections, delivery schedules continued without interruption. Nothing in the external world reflected the internal shift that had already taken place. My phone remained on the counter. There were no new messages from Olivia. That was expected. Communication had already transitioned into a different phase, one that no longer required frequency. Instead, updates arrived through structured channels, brief and procedural, confirming only what was necessary to maintain continuity. I checked one of those channels now, not out of anticipation, but out of completion of routine. The update confirmed that Olivia had arrived at her destination and had initiated contact with her interim advisor regarding next steps. There was no emotional language in the message, only status. I placed the phone back down and continued standing there for a moment longer. For the first time in a long time, there was no competing expectation attached to my time. No external narrative requiring adjustment or response. The absence of those variables created something that resembled clarity more than emptiness. Later that morning, I left the apartment and drove toward the financial district. The city was fully active by then, sunlight reflecting off glass buildings, sidewalks filling with predictable movement patterns of people moving toward objectives they did not question. The building I entered was not marked by prominence, but by function. Security recognized me without hesitation and allowed entry without verification delay. Inside, the environment was controlled, quiet in a different way than residential silence. This was operational quiet, the kind that exists when systems are already aligned and no longer require adjustment. I entered a conference room where a small group was already present. They acknowledged my arrival without interruption to their current process. A brief nod from each indicated continuity rather than initiation. I took a seat at the end of the table and opened a single folder that had been placed there earlier. The contents were already familiar. Updated ownership confirmation, structural transition reports, and finalized governance documentation. There was no new information, only confirmation of what had already been said in motion days earlier. One of the advisors spoke briefly, stating that all external communications had been handled according to protocol and that no disruptions were expected. I acknowledged this without commentary. Another document was placed in front of me, indicating final internal stabilization across all departments under Hayes Global Group. The language was precise, neutral, designed to remove ambiguity rather than introduce interpretation. I signed where required, not as initiation, but as completion. After the meeting ended, I remained in the room for a few moments while others exited. There was no urgency in their movement, only routine continuation of work that no longer required foundational decisions. When the room was empty, I closed the folder and placed it back on the table. The process was complete at the level that mattered operationally. Everything else was secondary execution. I left the building and walked several blocks without direction, not because I needed distance, but because movement itself had become the only remaining variable without obligation. The city continued around me in its usual rhythm. People passed without acknowledgement. Traffic signals changed in predictable cycles. Nothing indicated that anything significant had concluded recently, yet internally there was no longer any unresolved structure requiring attention. Later that afternoon, I received a brief message confirming that Olivia had requested an extension of her time away. The message was neutral, administrative in tone. I read it once and did not respond. There was no need to define the situation further. Definitions had already been established where they mattered. I placed the phone away and continued walking until I reached a quiet intersection where the sound of the city momentarily reduced itself into background presence rather than foreground demand. I stopped there, not for reflection, but for observation. The idea of direction no longer carried urgency. It carried only sequence. Everything that had been built, tested, adjusted, and corrected had already reached its final configuration. What remained was not resolution in the emotional sense, but stability in the structural sense. I turned and began walking again, not toward anything in particular, but within a system that no longer required correction. And for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to anticipate, because nothing unresolved remained in motion. The next morning arrived with the same precision as the days before it, but something fundamental had changed in how it registered. I woke up before sunrise, not because of habit, but because there was no longer any expectation pulling me toward a different schedule. The apartment was quiet in the same physical way it had been for days, but the meaning of that quiet had shifted. It was no longer absence of interaction. It was completion of structure. I made coffee without thinking, stood by the window, and watched the city begin its cycle below. Traffic lights shifted in timed intervals. Vehicles moved through intersections with mechanical consistency. Pedestrians formed temporary patterns that dissolved within seconds. Everything outside continued operating exactly as designed. I checked my phone once. There were no urgent messages, no escalations, no requests for clarification. Only one brief notification from a secure channel confirming that all transitional governance procedures had reached final execution status. The language was neutral, procedural, and absolute in its lack of ambiguity. I placed the phone down again and did not revisit it. Later that morning, I returned to the headquarters building, not because anything required my presence, but because closure at this level does not exist in a single moment. It exists in confirmation cycles. Security recognized me without hesitation. Elevators moved without delay. The upper floors remained unchanged in appearance, but quieter than before, as if the building itself had accepted a completed state and reduced unnecessary signaling. I entered a conference space where only a few individuals were present. They were reviewing final summaries, not initiating new discussions. No one looked up with surprise. My presence no longer altered the dynamics of the room. That fact registered without emotional response. A final report was placed in front of me, detailing the stabilization of leadership structure across Hayes Global Group and its affiliated entities. There were no open contingencies listed, no pending approvals, no unresolved dependencies. I reviewed the document slowly, not because I needed confirmation, but because the act of reading aligned perception with recorded structure. When I reached the final page, I signed once, not as authorization, but as acknowledgement that transition had reached completion. After the meeting, I remained seated while others left. The room emptied without urgency. Chairs were adjusted, papers collected, systems powered down according to protocol. I stayed until the silence felt fully stabilized, not as emptiness, but as equilibrium. Then I stood and left the building. Outside, the air was cooler than the previous days, carrying a slight shift in seasonal transition that most people would have noticed only subconsciously. I walked several blocks without destination. The city continued functioning with its usual disregard for internal narratives. That had always been its strength. Nothing here adjusted itself for individual perception. It only responded to collective structure. As I moved through intersections and sidewalks, I received one final message on my phone. It was from Olivia. The message contained no accusation, no request, only a single statement acknowledging that she understood the situation differently now, and that she would not be returning to the previous arrangement. There was no emotional framing attached to it. It was simply recognition of direction. I read it once and did not respond. There was nothing remaining that required clarification between us. The structure had already resolved itself through actions rather than conversation. I continued walking until I reached the river. The water moved steadily beneath the bridges, reflecting fragments of sky and glass buildings in broken continuity. I stopped there and observed without interpretation. For the first time in a long sequence of events, there was no internal anticipation attached to what came next. No expectation of correction. No requirement for reversal. The system around me had already stabilized into its final configuration. What remained was not resolution in the emotional sense, but continuation without disruption. I turned away from the river and began walking back toward the city center. Not toward recovery, not toward reintegration, but within a structure that no longer depended on contradiction to define itself. Everything that had been misaligned had already been addressed through sequence rather than confrontation. And in that absence of unresolved variables, there was nothing left to pursue. Only the quiet confirmation that the process had already completed itself long before the final moment was observed.